The thing that I lecture on is celestial navigation, and what I did is I brought in something called GPS, and in the last 5 years, GPSs have taken off. And the reason, as you probably know if you have one in your car, if you don't, if you buy a car, they say in about another 5 years, more than half the cars will have GPSs built in. But with the prices falling, where you can buy a GPS for about $129, and it'll show you anywhere you want to go, probably in the United States. But these things have been around for quite a while. The military has used them, and they're incredible. They can find your position anywhere on the planet within feet, within at least 30 feet, depending on the quality of what you buy. And they're now being used more and more by mariners crossing the oceans. And for obviously thousands of years, people didn't know how to cross the oceans. It's a rather difficult thing to do. And people crash onto rocks and on islands at night. But all of that slowly started to change. Well, this little thing, this little device called the GPS, is really amazing in that it can give you such accurate information. But there's a problem with this, and people that go offshore, either from like New York to Bermuda or New York to Africa or Europe, really run the risk of going awry if they just rely on something like this, though it is so accurate. So I'll just ask you, what's wrong with crossing an ocean with a thing that is accurate? Nelson?
You need satellites.
What's that?
You need satellites.
Okay, and if the satellites were all working well, what might be another problem with one of these things? I mean, it's more accurate than I'll show you a sextant. Right, it all relies on batteries. Just a couple of AA batteries, and that's all that it takes, and it'll run for years. But the fact is that if the batteries die and you didn't have backups, or they start road in a marine environment, you'd be out of luck. And if you didn't know how to use another method of celestial navigation, if you miss Bermuda, which is just a dot out there leaving from New York, the next stop would be Africa. So you really want to know more about celestial navigation than on this. Anybody think of something else that could go wrong with this?
Also,
yeah, if you dropped it or something, if it went overboard, and as it floated away, you said to your captain friend, you know that GPS thing? I dropped it, or I dropped it on the deck and it broke, and is that bad? And if you didn't know celestial navigation in another form, that could be obviously disastrous. So as great as these things are, there's a drawback to them. Well, obviously people have been traveling across bodies of water like oceans and seas for many thousands of years, and they've come up with methods that have been improved upon in some ways. And some of those old methods have been forgotten, and it's an unfortunate thing because they took thousands of years to develop. And when they're forgotten, it's very hard to bring them back. That knowledge seems to be gone and not easily brought back to life. So what I thought I'd talk about today is early methods of celestial navigation and other methods of navigation. In the most earliest form, and we could talk about people venturing off the continents, but even Prince Henry the Navigator, as he started to send people out towards Africa, he used some methods that didn't rely so much on the sun, moon, the planets, but he used other simpler methods. And some of those methods are still being used today. For centuries, navigators kept close to the shore and lined up rocks and shoreline marks, landmarks. What Prince Henry the Navigator told his people as they went out along the coast of Africa is put landmarks so that the next time somebody comes along, they can go up to that landmark, know where they are, and then go a little bit further. And doing things like that, they slowly but surely got themselves all the way around Africa. Well, by the end of the 1400s, we know that Vasco da Gama is going to make it all the way around to India, all the way around the African continent. And they also did things like use lead lines. A lead line is a line that is holding a piece of lead that's hollow on the inside, and he would drop that overboard. It might go down 50, 60, 150, 160 feet or more. And what it does, it picks up things off the bottom because the inside of that little hollow piece of lead has some fat in it. And it'll pick up what's on the bottom, and that can help people determine where they are, so that it might pick up sand, it might pick up shells, it might pick up rocks. And if you look at charts today, mariners' charts today will say that the bottom has sand, gravel, shells, rocks, and that will give you some more information about just where you might be, because the further you go offshore, you might find a different type of bottom. So some of these things have been used for a long time, and they're still used by a few people today. But a lead line is one of those things. Phoenicians used to cross the Mediterranean Sea by knowing more about the stars than their predecessors did. By using the stars, they could find their latitude. And we'll show you how to do that today. And using the stars especially certain stars, you can start to memorize and find your latitude quite easily, and I'll show you how to do that. If the skies were clear tonight, you could certainly go out and do what I'm going to show you. I'll give you a handout that shows you how to do that. But the stars, except for days like today, are helpful. Across the Indian Ocean, this is a thing called a kamal. Now, if you can imagine holding this piece of wood out and keeping these little knots in your mouth between your teeth, what you could do is hold it up as far as it would go, and then you would put that up to a star on one end and on the horizon on the bottom, and knowing where you want the star to be, that would tell you your latitude. So if you can imagine holding this out with the string in your teeth at a certain knot, clamping down on it, and then by doing that, holding it up to the horizon and holding the top up so that it hits a certain star, you would know that that's your latitude. And then sailing by latitude is a thing we've done even in colonial times here. We knew the latitude of all the colonies along the east coast of the United States. So sailing from England, what they did was they didn't know how to find longitude early on, but they knew how to find latitude. So what you would do is you would get to the latitude of the colony you want and just sail due west, and you'd hit it. So New York is around 42 degrees north latitude. Get to 42 degrees, sail due west, you're here. Not very difficult thing to do. Well, to show you how it can go awry, the Pilgrims were headed for what we would call New York today, and they obviously were off course. They ended up in Cape Cod, and because the weather was so bad, they decided to stay in Cape Cod and eventually establish Plymouth Colony. But they were really headed to what would be New York. So we have something like the Kamal, and people have improved upon the Kamal, but it's really a simple device that allowed people to cross the Indian Ocean. And even when Vasco da Gama got to the east coast of Africa, he needed an Arab navigator to get him across to India. Further north, the Vikings sailed to Iceland and beyond. We believe Vikings went not only to Iceland, but to Greenland and to Nova Scotia, and possibly to the Great Lakes. How did they do this? Well, a lot of it had to do with methods of navigation. We don't see much of anymore. Bringing birds with them and letting the birds go, knowing that birds would seek out land is a good way to navigate when you don't know where you're going. So they would bring birds with them, and as they thought, gee, I think we should stop for some nearby land, even though we don't know where it is, releasing the birds and seeing them fly in a direction and following them. Now you can't keep up with them, obviously, but you can know the direction that they're going, and that would give you a hint about where land might be found. Pacific Islands crisscross the Pacific Ocean, whether they were Polynesians or Micronesians, they crisscrossed the Pacific Ocean as if it were a pond, with navigation techniques that are still being used today. And there's been a revival of some of these techniques. They've been able to go from New Zealand to Hawaii to Easter Island without too much worry about where they were all this time. And this was being done over 1,000 years ago. And using their knowledge of things like waves and birds, the sky and the stars, they would travel to distant lands all over the Pacific. In one place, in the Marshall Islands, they made things called stick charts. And stick charts are a way of teaching navigation. Where the sticks cross, they would put usually a little shell, and those would be the islands. Well, I brought one in. Oh, yeah. So normally you would think it would be oriented like this, but the fact of the matter is it should be oriented like this,